and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today is one of India's leading intellectuals, and certainly the preeminent one of his generation. He's been a professor of government at Harvard University. He's recently published a book, The Burdens of Democracy. He writes extensively in columns, in newspapers, journals, and publications around the world. He's lectured extensively in the United States, in Britain, New Zealand, you name it. He's currently the president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research, a leading think tank in Delhi. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. I was sort of looking at your website, and it said he will continue to be loyal opposition. What is loyal opposition?
Well, I think the vocation of intellectuals is twofold. One, their society's risk investment in trying to think beyond the confines of what we already know, to think ahead into the future, to speculate a bit, to experiment a bit. And second, to not be bound by, in a sense, partisan considerations. Try and say this truth as you see it. You may be wrong, often you are in fact wrong. But at least you can try and ensure that what you say is not colored by or restrained by considerations other than purely intellectual ones. And that will invariably, I think, put intellectuals in some tension with the powers that be. So the phrase is from W.H. Auden, the loyal opposition, which I think is a good description of an intellectual's vocation.
To what degree is that public role circumscribed by ideology? Do you have sort of political preferences, or is it possible to stay objective, neutral? In your writings, you're as critical of the left as you are of the right. Is there a predisposition in some ways?
Well, there is a predisposition in the sense that there is a strong commitment to certain core values. And I think no political formation at the moment approximately exemplifies those values. Of course, you can't write if you don't have commitment to values. I mean, the idea is in a sense not to be a Zelig-like character whose values are changing under the name of objectivity or impartiality. I think some of the core values, liberal values embodied in our Constitution, are a good starting point. But as it happens, it is one of the, it is somewhat sort of tragedies of our political life, that there isn't a political formation that quite corresponds to those values. So you'll be sometimes, seen shooting at the left, sometimes at the right. You in a sense change the battle, but not the objective.
Your recent publication has been on looking at democracy. You've been professor of government. In a sense, that is one of the circumscribing ideas of your work and your interest. And the book really sort of talks about the deep search, the deep need, the success of democracy is the seeking for fundamental self-respect. A successful democracy provides that. You've written about the frustrations with how democracy in India has evolved from the initial celebration of a developing country, a struggling country, adopting democracy. What for you are some of the fundamental failures or failings of contemporary democracy?
Well, I think the simplest way of describing the failing, if rather than just sort of list a number of factors, is I think what we want out of democracy is sort of, I think, two things fundamentally. One, of course, democracy is a mode of popular authorization. It's a way by which we elect those who govern us. It gives us a chance to cashier their conduct if need be, and so forth. But I think the romance of democracy consists in trying to live in a society where you can feel at home. And by feeling at home, I mean saying, broadly speaking, most of the public decisions that are taken in these societies are decisions that you would actually freely accept, sort of as a citizen. I think the fundamental challenge in our democracy is there's a gap between the practice of popular authorization and the kinds of decisions that our democracy actually produces. So we are constantly in this paradoxical position of saying, yes, we have the right to cashier the conduct of our government. Yes, we engage in practices of popular authorization. But if you stand back and say, are these the policies that you would accept as free and equal citizens? I think a lot of the time we end up saying a big and resounding no. And the challenge is, in a sense, to try and bridge this gap.
You know, often intellectuals are accused of articulating ideas and a vision and a vision for the future without really addressing everyday issues, the mechanics of democracy. What are some of the elements that we can institutionalize, initiate, that will make sort of the philosophical aspiration real? So when the government looks at women's reservation bill, it looks at quotas, they're looking at mechanisms and strategies that would make this real. And obviously there's a great deal of criticism. What are some of the, you know, we know of your discomfiture with quotas and several other elements, but what are some of the things that you would suggest, that you would urge the government to do, or Parliament to initiate, not just the government?
Right. To begin at a very practical level, because I think that is the import of your question. You know, what institutional reforms would one like to see? I think, despite the fact that we are an open society in many ways, I think the political system, in fact, remains quite a closed system. And so one approach into the practical problem is, what are the institutional mechanisms by which this closure is produced? And I'll just cite 3 or 4 to begin with. First of all, take the structure of our political parties. Very few of our political parties practice intra-party democracy to any sort of successful degree. Now, if the main channel of articulation of ideas and the selection of personnel in a democracy is through political parties, and those political parties are closed shops, you're obviously closing out a lot of people. When somebody once joked that, you know, democracy is not about, well, it is partly about electors choosing who shall govern them, but more importantly, it's about political parties giving them options. And so if party institutional structures are closed structures, which is there are no clear rules of entry and exit, there's no clear rules of who actually gets to orient a party in one particular direction rather than another.
Would you legislate, make rules, laws to that effect? I mean, Mr. Session and the Election Commission, you know, tried that, but didn't pull it off.
No, I actually wouldn't. I mean, in part because I actually don't think legislation is the answer to most of the challenges that we face, and in part I also think legislation can produce adverse consequences, which is I think it is the case that you know, a free society will allow all kinds of political parties to flourish. My own sense is that actually it will be in the interest, especially of our major political parties, if they actually became more properly institutionalized and open. I mean, my sense is that one of the reasons we have such a fragmented party system is precisely because the rules of entry and exit in political parties are actually not clear. So I would appeal to their enlightened self-interest in some ways. I know it's a long shot. The second practical, I think, consideration is there is a lot of talk about decentralization in this country after the 73rd and 74th Amendment, sort of bringing government closer to the people, right-sizing it, you know, delegating decisions to the right
celebration
level.
Of Panchayati Raj.
Celebration of Panchayati Raj. The simple fact is we don't take decentralization seriously. Even now, the institutional architecture of devolution of power in rural India and urban India to a great degree is actually not clear. My own sense is that I think if you really want decentralization, what you will need is the kind of revolution that our founding fathers thought they were initiating in 1947. I mean, 1947, somebody would have said, look, is India suited for democracy? You know, 200 million unpropertied, unlettered voters. And they said, well, we'll take a leap of faith. The capacity will follow, in a sense, the devolution of power. I think with decentralization, we've got the argument backwards, which is we are always using the purported lack of capacity as an excuse not to devolve power. And I think unless citizens have a direct say in the things that affect them, in the mundane aspects of their existence, of, you know, can you participate in the decisions about location of schools, health clinics, water supply, the distance between democracy and its citizens will in a sense increase. Third practical proposal, which is a challenge for all large democracies, is of course the structure of campaign finance. We can all moralize about the extent of corruption and rent seeking, but the simple fact is organizing and mobilizing in a democracy of 1 billion people requires huge amounts of resources. And it is time that we thought of at least some form of state funding. I mean, I don't think state funding will go sort of all the way to solving the problems, but at least some form of state support, appropriately conceived and designed, for actually making the political system more open. And it will also have the added effect of addressing what many citizens think to be one of the key challenges of a democracy, the problem of accountability.
We'll come to more of that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, a leading think tank in Delhi. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
Bhangar Cement, सस्ता नहीं, सबसे अच्छा.
मर्दों और औरतों के सलून अलग अलग हैं, बाल अलग अलग हैं, तो फिर केश काला भी अलग अलग होने चाहिए. इमामी लाए हैं पहली बार खास मर्दों के लिए मिस्टर ब्लैक और औरतों के लिए मिसेस ब्लैक हर्बल केश काला तेल. मिस्टर ब्लैक, प्राकृतिक काले बाल जो रोज धुलने के बाद भी रहें वैसे ही ब्लैक. मिसेस ब्लैक, बाल सुलझाए बनाए प्राकृतिक काले. ये तेरा ब्लैक, ये मेरा ब्लैक.
और मिस्टर ब्लैक एंड मिसेस ब्लैक हर्बल हेयर डाई पाउडर में भी अब बनेंगी भारत में भी विश्व स्तरीय इमारतें. जर्मन टेक्नोलॉजी से बना वर्ल्ड क्लास सीमेंट. भांगर सीमेंट, सस्ता नहीं, सबसे अच्छा.
Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. You were a member of the Knowledge Commission. You resigned in frustration and anguish. What was the aspiration? What is the aspiration of the Knowledge Commission? And what are we looking to achieve? In obviously not just looking at higher education, primary education. We're looking at something much larger and much more inclusive. So what do we understand by this aspiration of knowledge?
I think the commission was set up with great hope, and I think the government, at least the Prime Minister, I think had a very clear understanding that in the 21st century, knowledge is going to be something that is going to be the heart of all the challenges that we actually face. I mean, it is the principal instrument of empowerment and mobility. It is the principal instrument of increasing efficiency. It is the principal instrument of coming to realize ourselves in the appropriate way so that our social relations
Is there
are
a
harmonious.
significance in the use of the word knowledge as opposed to education that we have traditionally used?
Yes, actually, absolutely. I think the emphasis in a knowledge society is not so much on, in a sense, learning facts or being the repository of received wisdom. It's really, in a sense, equipping students to actually make their own way in the world according to their best lights. So one of the things knowledge was meant to signify, not just a philosopher's sort of signification of justified true belief in some ways, but really I think the fundamental aspiration that knowledge is actually a continual process, and I think that is something that our education system by and large fails to impart. So that was meant to be one of the axes, which is how do you institutionalize a set of practices that the quest for knowledge, in some senses, pervades all aspects of your individual and social existence in all the institutional dimensions you can fathom.
Again, to go back to sort of the same question I asked you in the earlier segment about democracy, what are some of the mechanisms for this? Because I think that one of the great difficulties in India is that we have a great deal of articulation of ideas and vision statements and mission statements and programs and projects, but very little of it translates into reality because we haven't sufficiently looked at the mechanisms and the processes that will deliver on the democratic, the goals of democracy that you've been talking about, and to locate them within a realistic framework. It's like the issue that you mentioned of state funding of elections. Is it going to happen? Where is the pressure from civil society, from the community going to exert enough pressure on the political system that they conform? So when we're looking at a politician and the political process to reform itself, the expectations are pretty low.
Right.
But perhaps in education, the possibilities are better.
Well, the possibilities are both better and worse. They're better in the sense that I think one of the most astonishing things that is happening in India is that the demand for education and the quest for knowledge is taking on unprecedented dimensions. A lot of it is sort of ill thought through. We are muddling our way through sort of this aspiration. But from the top to the bottom of society in some ways. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing what parents in this society will do to make sure that their children get access to education now.
But the goal of that education isn't knowledge in the sense that you might say, but it's really, well, how can you get a better job? How can you make more money?
Right. No, I'm coming to that aspect. Now, there are two key lacunae in that education, or rather in that quest. One is, of course, the quest for that education at first glance is instrumental. But I think, as teachers and professors, one of the things that we often remark is that the process of education is, in a sense, how you can transcend your own previous steps. Clearly, an education that does not equip you to navigate the real challenges that you will encounter, that will not empower you in material forms in some respect, is not going to be an education that many people will actually aspire to. The trick in an education system is to take that as a given and then say, how can we use that as a base to build on something that is far more elevating and non-instrumental in some ways. And I think that is a conversation that we as a society actually do need to have. But the second obstacle, and at least from a practical policy point of view, I think this is even more important, is that just like with democracy, ultimately our education system doesn't want to trust our children, our teachers, and so forth. And unless you trust them, they will not have the confidence to be able to make their way in the world on terms of their own choosing. I mean, I think one of the things that's implicit in your question about sort of the instrumental uses of knowledge is that you take the terms of reference from what's already given. Look, this is the structure of the world. What's the best you can do yourself from the structure? What we found, at least working on the Knowledge Commission, I think this is actually widely shared, that our institutional structures are such that they will actually not allow you to experiment in order to produce the forms of education and knowledge that are actually non-instrumental. I'll just take one very prosaic example. One of the most astonishing things to me is that if you look at things like the Central Board for Secondary Education, they have virtually abolished long essays, even in subjects like Hindi and English. So you can have a child educated in this country who from class 8, class 9 onwards, till they reach MA, has actually not learned how to write an essay. Now an essay is a form which is inherently more reflective than your standard sort of respond to short answers or give objective type answer questions. So I think part of the lack that you are pointing towards, I think, is again driven by particular institutional logics that need to be opened up.
Isn't this sort of an extension of the idea that you had mentioned of the distance between sort of democracy and the citizen? Because what effectively happens is that whoever the individual, a minister holding office is, I mean, he gets together a group of people and decides that this is what needs to be done and this is what is good for education in India, and he does it. And 5 years later, or whenever his term is over, the next person comes in and does something completely different. What are the mechanisms? What can we do, concretely to encourage continuity, to encourage discussion, debate, consensus, and then so that consensus is enduring. It doesn't change with the fashion and the personal preferences or prejudices, if you will, of the person holding the particular office, and sometimes seemingly at odds with the Prime Minister or with government or larger policies of the institution.
Well, I think fundamentally, the reason
why did they get away with it?
I think our education seems to portray is, look, one of the propositions I think it is worth laying on the table very categorically, that in a society as large, complex and diverse as India's, you cannot have a single enduring regulatory structure that will command everybody's allegiance. Now, the way we cope with diversity in most other areas is to actually give people the maximal freedom we possibly can to actually do the best they can. Our approach within the education system and the regulatory structures we have created is just the opposite. I mean, I think we are the only country in the world practically where government pretty much regulates who you can teach, what you can charge them, you know, what the content of the curriculum is. My own view is, yes, there are certain risks in giving people freedom. You will get the proliferation of certain kinds of ideas and experiments that most of us as citizens won't like. But if you have a fundamental faith in the good judgment of most Indian citizens, you will be actually able to weed those out much more effectively than government is able to actually weed them out. So my answer, or rather you might say my non-answer to your problem, is actually what we need to do is create a regulatory structure that gives more freedom, rather than actually get caught up on this question of what is the unifying central consensus that government should actually go by.
You're watching a conversation with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, political philosopher, social scientist, and the director of the Center for Policy Research. Its president and chief executive in New Delhi. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
मैं भी होती थी परेशान जब बाल टूटते थे।
पैंटीन शैम्पू सैशे अब मिले सिर्फ ₹1.5 में। पैंटीन आपके बालों को बनाए मजबूत।
जब सिर्फ ₹1.5 में मिल सके मजबूती, तो परेशानी कैसी? शाइन पैंटीन।
नया चेरी ब्लॉसम एंटी एजिंग पॉलिश, जिसमें है चमड़े के लिए एक खास तेल, ज्यादा समय तक रखे जूतों को नया।
भांगर सीमेंट, सस्ता नहीं, सबसे अच्छा।
आंखों में ख्वाब बेशुमार लिए, कांधे पर आशा का संसार लिए, आज दिल ये चला है देखो प्यार लिए।
नया आयोडेक्स डबल पावर, डबल एक्टिव्स के साथ जो दर्द पर करे डबल असर। नया आयोडेक्स डबल पावर।
Welcome back to continuing conversation with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. You have written and expressed deep anguish and the manner in which reservations and the quota system were being implemented really as a form of appeasement, a short-term solution to a current crisis. What is your long-term perspective, view, suggestion, plan of action for affirmative action? Because you do recognize the need for affirmative action.
Oh, no, absolutely. I very strongly believe in affirmative action. I think we need to do 2 or 3 things. I think one, first of all, we need some intellectual clarity of what is affirmative action for. Now, clearly, to my mind, the most sensible answer is it is to give opportunities to those people who, because of the social and material circumstances they find themselves, have not been able to access as good or equal opportunities as others. The question then is reservations the best way of doing it? My sense is it isn't the best way of doing it for a number of reasons. First of all, we have to realize that in our society, the axes of deprivation are multiple. So caste is just one of these axes of deprivation. Gender is one, as we are now finding out. Religion in some areas can be one, region can be one, urban rural is another, income is another. So in the first instance, you need affirmative action policies that can actually take into account this range of deprivations which actually prevent people from accessing the full opportunities they do. And unless we actually do that, we'll not be able to serve even the constituencies that reservations actually pretend to serve. There is a whole range of sort of proposals out there of how to actually do this. It isn't actually terribly difficult, in some respects. So I think we need intellectual clarity in that. Second, and this is a banal proposition, but some of the most obvious things are the hardest to do in our democracy. The primary obstacle to accessing education in the right sense of the term is actually lack of income. Now, you can have all the reservations you want, but unless you compensate for that deprivation, you're actually not going to sort of empower those who you wish to empower. Now, you look at our spending patterns on education. They're still less than 4% of GDP, which is really nowhere near.
Isn't that a part of the problem, that we really look at our investments in education or health purely in terms of spends and financial allocations, and not really what happens with those allocations? And I think that the political class would argue that it is for intellectuals to propose the ideal, but they're not always on the pulse of what is possible.
Well, actually, you know, to defend intellectuals, to defend intellectuals, actually, I think in the case of education, there is a whole series of workable proposals out there. You know, for instance, a simple fact is, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the money doesn't get spent. Teacher absenteeism is 40%. There's very little accountability in the public system. Unless you create a system where parents have the authority to monitor the conduct of teachers, whether the teachers show up or don't show up, you're not going to get accountability. So the counter question to the political class is what prevents you from giving parents this authority? I mean, you know, we talk of lack of funding in education sometimes. The government is sitting on assets worth thousands of crores. A fraction of that could create an education revolution in this country. Why are we not willing to take that step? So I think it's a bit unfair to say that intellectuals are blueprints. They're actually very practical and workable blueprints. Parents in their daily lives are actually coming up with precisely those kinds of sort of workable solutions. But at every step, it is government that stands in the way of actually them realizing it. So unless we acknowledge this, I think we're not going to make much progress.
You know, you have argued and written extensively on the need both for economic reform, economic liberalization, and social justice. This was a phrase that the Prime Minister used. And one would imagine that, you know, where you have a government that is pro-reform, with supported by the left, a kind of sort of internal opposition, if you'd like to describe it, that would be sort of, you know, the ideal, you know, combination for India's circumstance. But it isn't quite working that way.
Well, it isn't quite working that way, I think, for the reason that we actually just mentioned a minute ago, which is, I think, the debate now in the question of social justice is not in terms of what symbolic actions will the government take to produce social justice. The debate has to move at the second level to which you gestured, which is how do you actually design effective programs? There is no shortage of funding in this country. And in fact, in some ways, economic reform actually helps that process because your tax buoyancy increases, you have more revenue. And when you come to answer that question about the design of social programs, there, unfortunately, the vested interests of the political class all converge in the same direction. The left-right distinction matters much less. I mean, you know, West Bengal, in some senses, is a pioneer in economic reform now. Its track record on health and education is as dismal as that of actually any other state. So my sense is, I think the left-right distinction in the designing of social service delivery programs actually matters less than their combined interest in making sure that you and I don't get empowered enough.
Tell me, you know, we talk about the vested interests of the political class, the vested interests of industry, of most groups. What is the vested interests of intellectuals? Entirely altruistic?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, no. Intellectuals have a very bad, poor track record. I think at two levels. I mean, at a very mundane and unkind level. I think, you know, intellectuals are often in the service of power, and intellectuals, like everybody else, are in a sense trying to strategize, maximize sort of some of their gains. I think at this juncture, I mean, if I were to say, sort of name the vested interest we have, is I think we are too risk averse about the kinds of institutional protections that we have actually become used to. And in that sense, we don't want to upset this equilibrium any more than politicians want to upset their own equilibrium, which I think disables us from performing the kind of critical role, or I should say rather good faith critical role that we can in fact perform. In
Well, I
society.
think the articulation and the acknowledgement of that can be the most definitive, positive, encouraging signal that we receive from one of India's leading intellectuals. Thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. This has
Thank you
been a
very much.
wonderful learning
Wonderful.
experience.
Thank you very much.
You were terrific. Thank you. Just hold on to that for a minute.